Hello and welcome to this special edition of the program Reparations for Nigeria, a platform dedicated to spotlighting the pressing issues that shape our national and continental narrative. I'm Abdullahi Ahmed. In the spotlight, we take a deep dive into a conversation long overdue, one rooted in centuries of exploitation, injustice, and resilience. At the 28th African Union Summit held in Addis Ababa from February 15 to 16 of this year, African leaders boldly united under the theme, Justice for Africans and People of African Descent through Reparations. With many European powers avoiding the subject, Africa is now taking the lead in demanding what history has long denied, accountability and restitution. Nigeria stands prominently in this dialogue, once at the heart of the transatlantic slave trade, particularly through the port of Lagos. Our nation bears deep scars from colonial plunder, forced labor, and environmental degradation. According to a newly unveiled reparations map crafted by Sudanese international law expert Major General Dr. Al-Taib Abdul Jalil, the United Kingdom alone owes Nigeria a staggering $320 billion, a figure calculated not as a price of pain, but as a step towards rebuilding our history and, of course, our future. As Africa reclaims its narrative, this conversation is not just about money. It is about memory, justice, dignity, and the right to heal. Stay with us on this special edition of the program as we unpack the implications of this historic shift, examine the case for reparations to Nigeria, and explore what true restorative justice looks like in the 21st century. Let's meet our panelists. Armsfree Ajanaku is the Executive Director, Grassroots Center for Rights and Civic Orientation. And of course, he'll be joined in the conversation virtually by retired diplomat with the ECOWAS Commission, Ambassador Haruna Warkari, who will be joining the conversation virtually via Zoom. Gentlemen, good evening to both of you, and thank you so much for joining me on the program tonight. Armsfree, good evening.
Yeah, good evening, Abdullahi.
Thank you so much for being here. First of all, let's talk about the concept of reparations or restitutions, looking back at the history of a continent that, for the most part, has been a victim of history. What are your 2 cents about this whole idea?
First of all, I think the African Union deserves a resounding round of applause and commendation for the courage to put this issue back on the front burner. Nigeria has always been a leading voice in this debate, whether you look at it from the point of view of abolition of apartheid, or even convening the voices of the stakeholders that should ensure that the historic injustices are not only redressed, but they are redressed on the terms of those people who are suffered as victims. Because one thing we have seen in this debate is that the European powers and all of the metropolitan powers that were neck deep in the exploitation, in the genocide, in the removal of not less than 15 million Africans, taken out of our continent. They want to be the ones to set the rules in terms of how the discussion of reparation or the discussion on reparation should go. They want to be the ones to tell us that, oh, we know we've committed grave injustices against you. Yes, we apologize for 1 or 2 of those cases, but this is how we think you should also be thinking about it. So what the African Union has done with the current theme of this year is to say we will not only look backwards in seeking for redress, we would look forward with a sense of justice, and we will not be fixated on just one definition or allow anyone to corral us into an understanding of what justice should be. So I think that that bold step has to be commended. I think another very fundamental point is to come to terms with the fact that many of the injustices we talk about that are historic, we have seen a continuity. We have seen various dimensions of neo-colonialism. We have seen a continuation of the decimation of the economies of countries who have hitherto been affected by these injustices. So looking back, in a sense, also means looking forward, tackling the present and current inequities in the international economic order, and also writing back to the powers that were responsible for these abuses, of the past, and letting them know that Africa, in the words of the late Murtala Mohammed, has truly come of age, and we know what is good in terms of our definition of reparation.
Let's take a look at this pie chart, breaking down the components of Nigeria's reparation claims, because as you can imagine, there is a lot of history regarding our colonial past and how this has shaped our current status quo, and Nigeria is just one of so many other examples. We're going to break down all of that history in just a moment, but let's take a look at that pie chart, breaking down Nigeria's key components when it comes to reparation claims. Now, some 15% of it is about lagging development, 20% of it because of the duration of the colonization. I mean, from the 1880s to 1960, when Nigeria, quote unquote, gained its independence. 25% of it on forced labor. Resource plundering is another 25%. Some people argue that it could be more. And of course, the environmental degradation or damage is at a 15%. All of this based on some of the analysis that have been made so far. So just give me your own understanding of whether these claims have the legal backing to actually see the light of day.
I think this is a very interesting question, because one of the arguments of the Europeans, for example, is to push the narrative that at the time some of these atrocities were committed, some of these abuses were committed, that colonialism was legal, that the slave trade, for example, was legal. That's their own argument. But we have to be able to, because this is not a time for textbook objectivity. This is a time to say, even those of us as analysts in civil society, we are an interested party because these injustices were done to our own forebears, people who were shipped out in chains. And that is why reparation must also have an emotional dimension. The emotional dimension whereby the burden of memory must be fully discharged. And what I mean by burden of memory, we've had situations in which people of African descent that in Americas, all over the world, they come back to relive those memories. And so the whole cost and mechanisms, the various mechanisms for that to be done, has to be part of the reparation. And that's why that breakdown of the data is really very important. The fact that as we are thinking about this, nobody says we have an already concluded template, but as different stakeholders are thinking about this and coming together with data and saying, okay, this is how people have been affected. This is how our economies have been affected. This is how even our politics, our governance, our institutions, many centuries down the line, still bear the traces. For example, you look at our police force. Because colonialism operated on the basis of a predatory police force, today our police as an institution has not yet been transformed. It still has.
You think there is an institutional traumatic traits that still exist because of colonialism?
Absolutely. And if you trace the history, you would see that it's there. And that's why, you see, I've tried to study a lot about how the European countries are reacting to this. There are some countries in Europe who come up to say, well, we don't bear a responsibility. We were never a slave trading power. We don't bear a responsibility for this whole discussion about reparation. Maybe the countries that individually were very active in the slave trade, for example, or in having colonial dominions in way back, they should be the ones to answer to it. But the answer to that is no. That cannot be a tenable argument. And the reason why the argument is not tenable is this. Now, you see, the profits from that trade in human beings, the profit from that bloody episode of the history from those centuries it has been shared collectively across the countries. So any country, even if you were not a slave trader, that you join up with the European Union, willy-nilly, you are already a beneficiary of the very discredited legacy of what what has happened. So we believe that the way Europe talks about its integration, common policy, common border policy, they should also not now make it the case that this becomes diffused to individual countries. This should also be a collective thing. They should look at the mirror and come to terms. I mean, in some cases, there have been apologies, there have been acknowledgements of those atrocities. But the question is, how do you build on those apologies? How do you build in terms of restitution? How do you build in terms of accountability to ensure that those historic injustices is not a question? Because we have example of the Nuremberg trials. Did they just go to the Nuremberg trials and say, oh, the Nazis were sorry and they just went home like that? There were reparations. The Israelis are still benefiting from those reparations till, to God.
Do you think the same case can be made for African nations like Nigeria, for instance, and say we also deserve our own version of what justice should look like for all the atrocities of the colonial masters done to this country?
Yes, absolutely, absolutely. Fundamentally, and I think this is one issue where our leaders, again, it also rests on leadership. This one issue that our leaders must also move, not just political leaders now, but cultural leaders, intellectuals. We must move to put this issue on the front burner of our public conversation. For instance, when you look at, when even the African Union made this declaration, how many Nigerians are aware of it? How many Ghanaians? How many Tanzanians? How many Kenyans? Where the Mau, we saw the ruthless role of the British in terms of suppressing the Mau, uprising. You understand? How many of them have been able to connect with these issues? So that is one sense. So, in a sense, there can be no running away from the fact that the people who have been violated deserve justice. I agree that justice is not only about money, but money can also be part of that justice. Justice can also be about, look at what's happening in South Africa, the land question. The land question has to be answered. In countries where you have people come in and take over the lands of the indigenous people, and today you have like 80% of the minorities controlling the land. That cannot be tenable. The land question has to be answered. Then I've talked about the emotional dimension, the fact that you've dehumanized people, the fact that you've degraded the environment, the fact that issues like the effect on the institutions, like I was talking about, that some vestiges of what they did in the past are being carried on, to the present, even as important as elections. As important as elections, all of those things played a role in how our institutions have shaped. But people will argue that, of course, colonialism happened decades ago. You should be able to move on. But how do you also move on if you don't transform the institutions?
Right. And do you see some sort of legitimacy to the argument that if you look at the conversation or the issue multidimensionally, you could say there are some silver lining with regards to colonialism? It doesn't make it right. However, as the conservative leader would like to point out, colonialism has its positive aspect in helping African societies organize themselves and become a lot more productive. The institutionalization of government and things like that, they pretty much helped a lot of African countries figure out how to administer governance and so on and so forth, to diminish the role that the traditional institutions were playing back then and so on and so forth. Do you think there is an aspect of the conversation that could be made to say, okay, what about the good aspect of it?
Yeah, I cannot analyze a situation in which bandits invade my community, and then maybe in the process they left a laptop, and then and then you now say, oh, the bandits that came to the community ravaged the community, took away our resources, took away our women, took away our children. Yes, they left technology for us. So I mean, we can use this laptop, or we can use the technology they left behind to organize ourselves. So it's a very disingenuous argument, and it's an argument that tries to adopt the ostrich approach. Have we not seen in civilization where technology was transferred, administrative systems were transferred? I mean, the Athenian democracy, where they had the police, was it really original to them? Did they not have interaction with Egypt, ancient Egypt, those ancient civilizations that they picked one or two things from? You know, the Pythagoras of this world, did they not pick from other civilizations? Did those civilizations have to overrun them and subjugate them and enslave them for that technology transfer to happen? So if, you know, we have seen transfer of technology in the past, we have seen transfer of administrative mechanism in the past, we have seen human interaction in the past that happened without a resort to violence, without a resort to colonial subjugation, then that argument around, oh, colonialism came with benefits, you know, really does not, you know, stand. Even though, yes, you can say, okay, there are benefits, but those benefits, by the time you weigh them, by the time you put them on a scale and then analyze it, you know, critically, would they have been benefits? Okay, the 50 million Africans that had to be taken out of the of our continent, how do you quantify that as against the benefits that the apologists of this system are talking about? So the conservative leader you're talking about, if it's Kemi Badenoch, well, she has actually
said reparations. The conversation about reparations is a scam, and that Europe or the United Kingdom should not buy into it.
Yeah. So my without necessarily sounding too sarcastic, I would say in this whole movement, you also have people who have become betrayers of their history, people who have are really, in a sense, they are like the in the Negro sense, what they call the house slave. They are the house slave who, and you know, the British Prime Minister put it very bluntly when he said, you know, she's posing as the savior of the Western civilization, self-appointed, you know, for that matter. So I think for that, the Africans who, in millions, our communities that have been victimized, that have been, you know, victims of these injustices, they know what they are facing. Yes, did we have our own internal contradictions as a society that facilitated those processes? Yes, there were those internal contradictions, but the ultimate responsibility lies with those people who demanded for human beings, who wanted human beings as a means of exchange for very funny things like mirror and things like that. So for us, we should keep our eyes on the board. And for me, voices like Kemi Badenoch, they are distractions to the global movement for reparation, because she's not more knowledgeable than the UN that is having regular convenings on this issue. She's not more knowledgeable than all the experts that are even putting figures, data to the damage that has been caused and how we can you know, ensure that these issues are redressed.
Right. Okay. Let's bring in Ambassador Haruna Warkani, who's joining the conversation virtually via Zoom. Ambassador, it's always a pleasure. Thank you so much for joining us on the program. Is this conversation around reparations or restitution a no-brainer for you, understanding the world we live in today? All right. It appears we've lost our connection to Ambassador Warkani. We're going to work on that to get him back into the conversation. But just to double down, Armstrong, the point you just made right now about shared responsibility, right? Because the counter-argument has always been there are African collaborators in this whole exploitation that we're talking about, in the plundering of the resources, human resources, material resources, and so on and so forth. So how do you share this responsibility in this conversation about reparations or restitution. What do you do about the African collaborators who are most likely going to have descendants that would be beneficiaries if the West is supposed to pay for what has happened?
Yes. So nobody has all of the answers clearly laid out, and which is why it's also important that one of the mechanisms that has been established by the African Union is the setting up of a fund, a reparation fund, and the role that that fund will play. I mean, the proposal to set up the fund now, the role that that fund will play is for the purpose of knowledge gathering knowledge about all of these processes, all of these things that have transpired, centuries back. See, today in communities, people know. In fact, some people still boast in Nigeria of today that so family, they were our slaves. So it means that through oral tradition and through passing the message from generation to generation, people can still be traced who were responsible, who were internal collaborators, and the details of how they can also be held accountable, and to ensure that there's a balance and you're not also rewarding the descendants of those who actually contributed to that will be done. Reparation is also not a replacement for our own internal governance reforms, the governance reform that we need internally, because we also have a situation in which, even in contemporary times, the resources of our country, like in case of Nigeria, we had funds being looted outside the country by our own people. And have we been able to ensure that there's accountability and those loopholes through which our resources disappeared are really addressed? So those governance questions they are there, but there can be no running away from the ultimate responsibility. The architects, the people who designed this system, the people who vigorously implemented this system and benefited from it for centuries, amassed a lot of wealth. And let me also say that the other point, there's another point about what they call reparation in the context of culture and artifacts. That's, you've had in recent years now with the return
of some artifacts.
Yes, some artifacts, like some of the Benin bronzes have been returned and all of that. The whole process of governing that is also important. How do we also ensure that these artifacts become a treasure base for a cultural revival and not just, okay, they returned it, maybe you even go to some of the museums now, weeds have overrun.
We understand that some are still in Europe today.
Yes, they're still, because many of them fell into private collections. Private curators bought off many of these artifacts, and the heritage of our people, the cultural heritage of our people was not, we're now sitting in private hands. And so that whole movement, that's one dimension of the movement, which we can say silver lining. Yes, there has been a silver lining in that sense of return. But has there been a silver lining in terms of how we properly warehouse these things and ensure that the coming generation actually understand this history, understand what happened to us as a continent, and the way forward from there?
Let's talk about the economic element of the conversation. 350 billion, that is the estimate. The United Kingdom is reportedly supposed to pay in reparations to Nigeria alone. Now, Great Britain, which is one of the greatest colonizers in history, colonized Nigeria, Ghana, Kenya, Uganda, Sudan, South Africa, Zambia, Zimbabwe, Malawi, Sierra Leone, Botswana, right? If 350 or so billion is supposed to go into reparations to Nigeria, and you look at the number of countries that could probably come cap in hand and say, where's our own reparation, right? With its GDP of a little over $3 trillion, it's safe to say that the UK could go broke trying to pay reparations. And under the current global economic climate, how realistic is reparations in this climate today?
Yeah, that's why the arguments and the conversations have actually made it apparent that reparation is not only about money. You have the case of the Namibians, you know, the Germans making that decision to pay them reparation. But that is still hanging till date. Because for the people, there are other dimensions of reparation that have not been properly addressed. So even those processes have come under a lot of criticism. They have come under a lot of attacks. And that is why a key component of the reparation debate is the question of participation. And that area of participation, whereby there is exhaustive dialogue with civil society, there is exhaustive dialogue with cultural institutions, so that collectively, because this is not a situation in which people in Europe will just sit down and say, okay, we think this is what, even those reports that made those conclusions in terms of, okay, this is the amount and this is amount, you understand? How much of them, of those reports had the participation? Yeah, some of them were expert reports, but how much of those reports went through the process of validation? And that is why I like the UN system, the Permanent Forum on, you know, peoples of African descent, where they are drumming up the question of civil society participation. They're drumming up the question of community participation in designing this process. Maybe in the end, by the time you have a very exhaustive and very consultative process, which is part of also what I commend the African Union for, because they have also made it clear that they're going to be investing in a lot of research, knowledge gathering. Because, again, it bears repeating to say it's not just about money. It is also about memory. It's also about documentation.
And how novel is this idea of restorative justice? Because it looks like it's not enough that they're saying we're sorry for what happened. There is something more that should accompany that apology or that reconciliation in terms of relationship and so on and so forth.
Yes. So the whole question about restorative justice is important. It's a very important component of the conversation, but it goes beyond money. And why I say it goes beyond money, if, for example, the people who perpetrated these acts are saying, oh, part of what we are going to do is also to do an exhaustive documentation of what we know from our own end as a way of closure. Because till date, there's still no closure in many communities. There's still no closure in many countries about these issues. So if, for example, documentation is taken as part of that restorative justice, it means that we know what happened to our people. Africans in the diaspora can also have those things to fall back on. They can say, okay, there are community projects like Badagry, which was a slave port. We are restoring that place. We are ensuring that everything about the memory of how those processes, worked out, we are putting them in place. That is an effective step towards at least placating the people. Because if there's no closure and then you just come and apologize, you understand? It means that, and that's a key component of the reparation debate, the fact that will this not be repeated again? The non-repetition is a key principle in the discussion around reparation. That is ensuring that this whole injustices will not be repeated. And we saw, like in 2020, the Black Lives Matter movement and all of that. We saw, in a sense, a repetition. We saw where lives no longer mattered, and even state law enforcement could claim someone's life without any judicial process. Right. So these are the key issues. And in cases where money comes in, I would like to prefer, as our organization, as someone actually following this process very closely, we don't have to distribute, we don't necessarily have to distribute monies to every family, because maybe you might do that and you end up giving each person $500 or $1,000. That really, you might decide to do legacy projects. You can decide to build schools. You can build hospitals where the community, in a shared sense, will use that as a monument to remember what transpired in the past, and to that would be like a lighthouse to show that a step was taken, in the right direction.
Right. You're watching this special edition of the program Reparations for Nigeria, as we look at restorative justice and, of course, the position of the African Union about what is fair, what is just for the former colonies of the global powers today, especially in an effort to correct the wrongs of the past, or at least attempt to make some sort of justice feasible for some of these colonies who are still reeling from the impact and the implication of those experiences centuries or even decades ago. We're going to take a quick break. We'll be back in just a moment. Stick around.
Nigeria have to demand more than that amount that they are calling, because they have done a lot to us and the impact is still on. Due to colonization, now we are not united. A lot is going on. All these kidnappers and those things, those people are still behind all this thing. So we demand more than that. And also my question also goes to Nigeria. The little that we have, or the little that they have, how are they managing the oil money and the rest? How are they managing them? You get it? Yes, so it's another question. So even if they give her that amount, are they going to use it the way it's supposed to be used? Because Nigeria have more than that 3 billion, this one that they are talking about. But we have not seen anything. We've not seen any change. So provided they give them, they are going to use it and it's going to have impact, positive impact on us. It's good.
In as much as I believe that Nigeria deserve to be paid back for such, it's not monetary. Because what the greatest thing they stole from us that need to be released or we need to be compensated for me, is beyond money. So let's focus on where it matters the most. They colonize our leadership. They colonize our ideas and our ideologies, our education system. The entire system is colonized. So for me, money is more than money. If they truly want to compensate us, they should allow us, our leaders, our leadership, they should leave our leadership, allow our leadership and system to operate the way it should be. They should no longer colonize our system. For me, Nigeria's problem is not money, it's leadership, and it has to do with some of those things.
Not all about money, but as it stands now, money has its own way to play. Have you seen it? Now, as the nation is, we have a president that has money. Now, we all hope that when he came to the power, because he has money, things will be lesser. But there's no way. He comes up and everything increases. Look at a bag of cement, for instance. Look at spaghetti, look at Indomie. Before, when he was there, things are not this, like this. He came to power, we think that everything will come to 0 naira. He now doubled them times 3, times 4. So it's not all about money. But giving us such money is also helping the nation, if the leaders will know what to do with it.
Whatever I tell now, maybe I don't think they are going to do it, but Nigeria should stand on their feet. Because we are cheated a lot. This country will come and cheat us, this country will come and cheat us. After all, they will just throw us back and abuse Nigeria, that Nigeria is nothing while we are something. So Nigeria is the giant of Africa. So why can't we stand on our feet and fight for our rights? So that's my point.
Welcome back to the program. Of course, the thoughts of Nigerians on the streets there have various views about what reparations means for them and whether they think this is something feasible and something that can actually make a difference in the life of Nigeria as a nation. Back here with us in the studio, we still have Armsfree Ajanaku helping us navigate some of these conversations. We're still struggling to get through to Ambassador Haruna Warakani, who is also supposed to be a part of the panel for this conversation. Just to double down on the reality on the ground, what are the chances that this conversation could end up becoming an academic exercise at the end of the day? I mean, there's global precedent for it as far as the history shows. in Asia, for instance, in America, for instance, but these are somewhat relatively smaller in terms of scale compared to reparations for African nations, such as Nigeria, for instance. What are the chances, do you think, that this could end up becoming a reality, even if it's a phased implementation, or do you think that we could just have this conversation over and over again without any needle moving?
No, I'm very optimistic, Abdullahi, and when you engage on conversations that touch, that touch at the heart of the history of injustice, that touch at the heart of racism, in a sense, and what I can describe as man's inhumanity to man, there is no amount of hope that you will say is too much to be invested in such a process, because the abuses themselves, they did not just happen across 1 month, 10 years, 1 decade. This was centuries of a system that exploited, that dehumanized, and that ensured that people did not get their full rights. And so if we have instruments like the United Nations Declaration on Human Rights, we have instruments on the rights of indigenous people, we won't have specialized mechanisms that are currently carrying on these conversations. We should be optimistic enough to not just have blind hope, but also play our part. I just talked about the role civil society should play in terms of ensuring that the conversation is carried on, and what our leaders at the level of the African Union are doing, we should be able to ensure that it goes on the ground and people get this awareness. And where there is the critical mass of voices making these demands, the powers that be would have no choice than to accede to some of these demands.
Right.
I also am cognizant of the challenges which some of them have given, which I also describe as excuses, when you were benefiting from all of these ill-gotten wealth, when you were growing your economies on the back of slavery, growing your economies on the back of colonialism, moving resources out of the colonized territories. You did not have any qualms. Now that it's time to just take the right step and do the right thing, you're having excuses all over the place. There are legal dimensions. There are countries who make commitments. There will be conversations. Right. Nobody's going to put a gun to anybody's head.
Right.
But that intellectual capital we need to drive this has to be on the table. And I think the final point I'll make before I yield is the fact that I feel a sense of dread, that the Europeans, criticize this as a theme. When the African Union put up this theme, they looked at it as a theme that is still looking backward. But you have to look backward to know where you're coming from. Because if you really don't know where you're coming from, then you will not have the resolve to design a future that is prosperous and inclusive.
All right. I think we finally got through to Ambassador Haruna Warkani, who is going to join the conversation via phone. We have a couple of minutes to spare. Ambassador Warkani, as always, pleasure to have you join us on the conversation. We've covered much of the ground regarding this conversation, but I want to get your input on what some would say has been restitution applied through the back door, through diplomatic channels, through aid, for instance. We've seen a lot of global aid come towards Africa in social services, in education, in healthcare, and all of these other avenues. Some would say that has considerably done some good to repair the damage done to the continent, especially looking at it from the Nigerian perspective. What do you have to say about that?
Thank you, Ahmed, for having me. Viewer, that positioning cannot be correct because Europeans have truly been very, very unsincere about Africa, and particularly the question of reparation or restorative justice for what they have done to us as a people. Imagine I mean, 15 million people out of Africa through slavery alone is more than some countries put together, population of some countries. Now, whatever NGO kind of a thing or funding they may tell you they have done to Africa, that is minuscule to what actually the damage has been. And it has no cognizance whatsoever to what has happened in Africa. Has any aid changed anything in Africa? The answer is no. There is no amount of aid, there is no system of aid, there is no positioning of aid that has changed our continent. Most of the aid money actually is a bound money. I mean, money that were earmarked for us in Africa, it came here and bounced back to Europe. When they give you aid, most of it is spent drinking coffee and tea in the hotel. Most of it is spent on air tickets. Most of it is spent on per diem. Most of this money is spent on buying vehicles that we don't have any need for. Most of this money is spent on consultancy services, which has no relevance to us absolutely. If you ask the simple question, for instance, is there any project in Africa that we can point to today as means of infrastructure, roads, water, power lines, power stations, anything, major hospital, major university, and other facilities? Are there any that you can trace the European, as a European Union or the specific European country? The answer truly is no. What we are seeing as true friendship is today coming largely from China. We can point to some roads in almost all African countries. I mean all African countries. You can say this is a stretch of road that the Chinese have built, either by loan or grant. But physically, there is an infrastructure we can point to. For the Europeans and Americans put together, there is nothing on the continent that we can say is traceable to any one of them. Therefore, any question of aid or whatever has no relevance to the reparation we are talking about.
Right.
We need to be more serious with this reparation of an issue.
Okay.
We need more experts. We need more activists. We need more mobilization. The whole African continent needs to be mobilized to show that we understand what is happening and we are standing firm for it.
Okay.
The Jews, don't forget, the Jews have shown how clearly they have been very vocal, very consistent, very resilient in their pursuit of reparation for what has happened to them at the end of the First World and Second World War. So that is the kind of zeal Africans should pursue this. The African Union needs to come out of its chair and talk more assertively of why this injustice, the injustice of centuries, should not just be left to go like that.
Okay. All right. For want of time, we clearly need more time to analyze this one. I get the feeling that this is probably going to be episode 1 of many other episodes to unpack and navigate these issues. Ambassador Warkani, thank you so much for making the attempt and of course for joining the conversation even at the 11th hour. Thank you so much for your time. Armsfree Ajanaku, we're going to have to end it here for now. I get a sense that we're going to circle back to this one because there's a lot more to unpack regarding this issue and what it means for Nigeria and the rest of Africa going forward. Thank you so much for the analysis.
Thank you, Abdullahi.
I appreciate you for joining us for this conversation. All right, and that is it for our special edition of the program. Thank you so much for joining us. My name is Abdullahi Ahmed. Thank you for your time.